Hello friends and welcome back. My name is Katie and today we are doing a fun video. We are doing me reacting to your unpopular opinions. What could go wrong? The first time we did a video like this was I think in May last year, so it's been a little while. And I had so much fun with that video. I know a lot of you did too. The reason I'm reacting to these is because I think these kind of discussions are interesting. Not to put myself up on some pedestal to like tell you whether you're right or wrong. I will be giving my opinions and I will be quite firm and strong with my opinions when I feel like I want to be. But I don't think I'm an expert on tarot or morality around tarot or anything like that. I feel like disagreement in the tarot community and New Age communities is not embraced enough. And just being open to conversations about difficult subjects, I think that is too often shunned in this community. I myself have experienced being told to shut up about a subject that I care a lot about by people who just don't want to have difficult conversations and just want everybody to be nice to each other all the time. And I'm here to tell you that as far as I'm concerned, healthy community that is inclusive and celebratory and safe for everybody needs disagreement. It needs us to have courage and to be open to hearing other people's opinions and to engaging in conversations that make us feel uncomfortable. Now, I'm not saying that this video is on any level like gonna shift the paradigm and like all of a sudden equality will exist. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that I think we need to get more comfortable with disagreeing with each other. And so we're gonna do a little bit of that in this video. Strap in. Our first one, tarot size cards are too big and inaccessible. As for a personal preference, I think that's totally fair enough. I tend to prefer the more standard size tarot cards. For me, they are the easiest to handle. As for the second part of this opinion being that tarot size cards are inaccessible, I do think this is a little more complex. I think tarot size cards can be inaccessible to some, but so can smaller cards and so can bigger cards. Different people with different skills and abilities will find different size cards easier to use and handle. For example, people with limited motor skills might prefer bigger cards because they are easier to handle if you don't have quite as much dexterity. Whereas for other people, smaller cards will be easier to handle. So I don't think the standard tarot card size is inherently inaccessible across the board, and that one size is inherently more accessible than the other because everybody has different access needs. And what we are seeing more and more is that different card sizes are becoming available, whether it's across different decks or even the same deck being offered in different sizes, which I think is fabulous. I don't think there is any need to do a proper spread when pulling cards. I totally agree. I tend to be someone who likes spreads, but not always. But I know there's heaps of readers who get a lot of value out of doing like really freeform readings, which is a cool skill and also just a preference. There's too much focus on divine aspects in some decks. It's like they forget people are atheists. Plus those aspects tend to be gendered, which hugely puts me off as an NB. I totally agree, especially with the second part of this about it often being quite gendered. As for the focus on divine overall, I think, I don't know, maybe there's just like a market for that. I think a lot of people who are interested in tarot have some sort of element of spirituality, but you're right, not all do. Reversals aren't necessary. I think it's totally a preference thing and a style thing, and I think you can sort of figure that out as you go along as a tarot reader, and you can also change throughout your practice over the years. I think there's too much focus on the fool's journey when talking about the major arcana and in writings about the major arcana in tarot books. We don't know the original order of the majors, and the explanation that I sometimes read that people in the 15th century would have known the order of the cards without them being numbered seems unsatisfactory. I just wish to see more critical reflection on the order of the majors instead of everybody just repeating the idea of the fool's journey. I think the fool's journey is very much an example of one of the many systems that has sort of been imposed upon tarot because it kind of sort of fits and we like to see patterns throughout, you know, cultures and time. And I think part of that is this desire some people have, and especially have had historically, but I think people still have it, to sort of like validate tarot with some like ancient truth. I think whatever you want to put onto tarot that helps you make sense of it, helps you get more meaning out of your readings, whatever it is, like that's cool. But I think you're right in saying that, like assuming that the fool's journey like was inherent in tarot and so therefore is like somehow like true or right or correct. And we also know that people have switched cards around to like fit systems. And you're right, maybe we need to be a little bit more conscious and like actively talking about the fact that that is another layer that has been added retrospectively onto the cards. I don't know if I have many unpopular opinions. I don't think there are many shoulds. I agree with that. Maybe my unpopular opinion is if you're going to read tarot, you should study tarot at least a bit. For me, intuition is based on a springboard of knowledge. I think that's definitely true for me and how I have found like I got the most out of tarot. Like I'm not bothered by people who just pick up the cards and are like, this is what the image is telling me. Like, do you? I don't care. The Tower is a great card. Sure. I mean, it's great in a lot of ways. It's not always fun though. I believe a lot of tarot deck collections and collectors are driven by consumerism who have hoarding tendencies. I'm not judging anyone for having huge collections, just stating what I perceive. I'm sort of conflicted about this opinion in my response to it. So I can definitely see that they're in the tarot community, especially in the online spaces that, you know, we participate in, there's a lot of consumerism that goes on. And I think it's important that we can sort of like hold space for difficult conversations that challenge us around that sort of behavior, especially when it becomes unhealthy. But I do think sort of saying that you think that that is driven by other people's who are demonstrating hoarder tendencies, I don't think that's helpful. Hoarding and even hoarding tendencies are very specific behavioral patterns. And I don't think you can tell what is happening in someone psychologically or literally in their home or financially based on a few videos that they share online. Some people might be more open about their like experiences and might describe their own experiences that way. But I think as a viewer to sort of make that assessment of somebody else is really unhelpful. And I don't think that that is insightful. I think there's a lot of assumptions inherent in that. I do think that it's very much for the individual and their family and their own situation to sort of determine what is healthy and what isn't for them, because that is totally subjective to their own experiences, their own situations, their own homes, their own financial situations. Like there's so much that goes into that as to whether something is a problem or not in somebody's life. And for somebody that can be a collection of 10 decks is unhealthy. For somebody else, it might be 1,000. So I don't know, you will not find me saying anything about whether I think somebody has any kind of hoarding tendencies or addictive tendencies or anything like that. I might reflect on that myself at times, but I will never project that or say that, or I don't know, I just don't even think that way about what other people are doing with their lives and their decks. Do I think that some people exhibit consumeristic behaviors? Yes, but I will not make that leap into making assumptions about hoarding tendencies or addictive tendencies. I feel like the deck market is oversaturated with decks, creators, and publishers that oftentimes reuse ideas and deck styles. In the end, a lot of decks all kind of look and feel the same, with very far and few between that offer a truly unique perspective. I do see what you mean. I do feel like there's a lot of sort of jumping on like trends and even sort of like branded sort of tarot decks. Like the Supernatural tarot decks just come out, and we've had like the Friends tarot deck and the RuPaul tarot deck. Like it feels like anything that possibly could sell to any market, there will be a deck made. It's like Rule 34 but for tarot. There is a trend of all-inclusive decks and not buying decks or supporting artists who do not create all-inclusive or body-positive decks. My unpopular opinion is that this is art. It shouldn't rely on this idea. If an artist does not make it all-inclusive, it's not bad. It's an artist's right to do so either way, and I feel like this all-inclusive trend is more limiting than it is anything else. I think, you know, I'm going to disagree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, I did so in the last video for comments like this. So let's recap. Just the idea that more perspectives, more people, more experiences, more body types, more colors, more abilities is limiting? That makes no sense to me whatsoever. You are right though, that artists are allowed to do whatever they want with their art. The catch is though, we as consumers and buyers are also allowed to make decisions about what decks we do and don't want to support and what art we do and don't want to support. If an artist is actively choosing to omit huge portions of the community and of the world, like I don't want to support that artist, they're allowed to make that deck. And people who want to support that can. I don't have to, and I won't. And in the same way artists are allowed freedom of speech and expression, I am also allowed freedom of speech and expression to share my opinion on the fact that I don't think those decks are good enough and I do not want to support them, and to share my opinion on when I think art is harmful. Because it can be. Art and life and our experiences, these things all intermingle. Art is not some like magical sacred thing to be put up on some pedestal, never critiqued, never questioned. And especially in tarot decks. These are tools, things that we interact with emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. And you're right, not every deck has to be 100% inclusive, whatever that means. But the idea that we as tarot consumers and a tarot community should not always be striving for our community and the art that we surround ourselves with, that we constantly talk about, that is central to our community, should not be representative and welcoming and safe for as many people as possible, I think is at best naive and at worst harmful. We already have so many decks that present no diversity whatsoever. The idea that representing different people and different experiences would limit tarot or art in any way, just I don't understand that logic whatsoever. So I obviously feel very strongly about that, but I'm sure you knew that going in because that's been a constant on my channel for years. I love the Rider-Waite-Smith, but wish someone would come up with a new, more updated classic system to add to the roster rather than just having more and more Rider-Waite-Smith clones. I think there have been lots of times where people have updated the system, although I suppose it depends on what you mean by updated. And I also understand why people are sort of just rehashing the Rider-Waite-Smith, but with some updated symbolism, because one of the examples is to provide some representation and diversity in a deck that is like wholly white. But does US Games have to release a new like coloration or edition of the Rider-Waite-Smith every other month? No, stop it. I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently spiritual about the cards. They can just be a fun card game without any crystals, candles, or pagan witchy extras involved. I've seen quite a few people annoyed that other people don't treat the cards similarly to them and seem to think that it's disrespectful. But I don't believe what they believe. I completely respect people who have a very sacred approach to tarot, but I'm not a fan of when people sort of impose that upon others, because we don't all think the same, we don't all approach the cards in the same way, and we don't all believe the same thing. So I totally agree with you. Reversals are integral to a clear tarot reading. For me, a reverse card lets me express another viewpoint. Without reversals, a card's implied meaning gets too vague, too ambiguous. So we've sort of already covered this. I don't use reversals, and I don't think they're integral to a clear reading at all. I think it definitely depends on how you read. So I think if you feel like you need reversals, cool. But I don't agree with the idea that they're necessary for everybody to use tarot and to use it well. This is a long comment, but there was a question in here, so I'm just gonna read that out. Do you think that atmospheric props detract and distract from the clarity of a reading? I think this totally depends on the person. Like we know from studies that students are often advised to sort of sit in the same place, to wear the same thing, to have the same music playing, because it's almost like a cue to your brain to start concentrating and to get into the right frame of mind for what you're about to do, the activity. It's the same with like sleep hygiene. You're often told to get into a sort of routine because it helps your brain know what's coming and to prepare for sleep. I think the same is true for like ritualistic practices and those props that you talk about for some people. Sort of lighting that candle, burning that incense, whatever it may be, I think sort of sets that stage for people. So I definitely see the validity in it. It's not something that I really engage in just because I don't feel the need to. Of course, I think that there can be situations where we get into the trap of focusing more on the props than on the activity itself, but I don't think they are always distractions. The tarot we know today comes from a card game made in Italy during the 14th century, and the essence of tarot comes from much more ancient spirituality, are ideas that can coexist. Sure, I don't know how accurate it is, and I don't know, like it depends what you mean by the essence of tarot. Yeah, I don't really, like I know what you're saying, but I don't really understand what you mean specifically, so I can't really comment on it. All you really need in life is one tarot deck. I went over a decade with just one tarot deck, and since getting into TarotTube, it's driven my desire for more oracle decks and more tarot decks for every season of the year. And don't get me started on oracle decks. You can convince yourself you need so many different oracle decks because they all have different approaches. Sometimes I miss the time when I had one deck I picked out because I connected with it and no oracles. I've said this before, I totally agree that you only ever need one deck, and that can be like literally a deck of cards that you've had in your family for years. If you want to get into tarot, you only need one deck. And I can certainly appreciate how consumerism can get out of hand for people. I know that it certainly did for me when I first started getting into TarotTube. I think especially when like our content is created around decks, and I know as much as people say that they want to see us go deeper with some decks and not just see unboxings all the time, the fact of the matter is the unboxings get views, like sometimes more views than any other video that you could spend hours, days, weeks making. As content creators, it can be very easy to sort of get into the habit of getting new decks to share and make content about. And then I think like that situation, which is specific to content creators, can then translate to viewers sort of thinking that they have to, or feeling that they have to have every new deck as well. And on top of that, like the market is like, I know tarot is connected to spirituality for a lot of people, but at the end of the day, the people making and producing a lot of these decks, although they may like have a passion for tarot, they are also business people a lot of the time, especially for the publishing houses. Like they're putting out what they hope and think people will spend money on. And I love it when people are open and sharing that sort of process more. I mean, I haven't bought a deck in, I think, over a year. I think the last deck I bought was the Our Tarot. But I definitely went through my own period a few years ago of being a little bit overexcited, and also like the pressure of like having content and new interesting things to share with people. Like that did influence my spending habits. So I'm super conscious of that now, and that's why I haven't bought a new deck and why I don't want to do unboxings on this channel, at least not often. I do not want to become an unboxing channel. Not because I have any judgment on people who are, but because I know that that would only sort of fuel that tendency that I have struggled with before. I like having different decks for different seasons, not because I need them, but because I enjoy that. So I think there is a balance to be found, and that balance will be like, that line will be different for everybody. Some people will love and be committed to one deck their whole life, and other people, you know, will enjoy having different decks. Other people will enjoy collecting. And I don't know, I think for some of us, maybe we sort of like float back and forth on that line till we figure out what actually is important to us and what we want out of our tarot decks in our collection. People without credentials or experiencing pathologizing actions as hoarding or addiction isn't okay, and they shouldn't make videos about it. As someone who has experienced a hoarder in the life of my loved ones, it isn't having just a lot of something that brings you joy. And as someone who has personally experienced addiction and lost friends and family to addiction, I find calling this offensive personally. Something like a shopping addiction is real, but it also isn't okay to diagnose others, especially online and without their consent, or even imply it. Making a video about your own emotional journey is something different, of course. I agree. I do not think pathologizing or using pathological language, or even language that implies a pathology, is helpful when you're talking about other people. Like if you go and watch somebody that has a massive collection, calling them a hoarder or saying that they have an addiction, it's not helpful to them. It's not helpful to you, and it's not helpful to people who truly do struggle with those things. So don't do that. And if you've been following me for a while, you will know that I've struggled with substance abuse and addiction issues in the past too. So I also have like particular thoughts and feelings about people using those words. I could almost make a whole video on it, and maybe I will, but I guess I'll just say briefly here, I think I worry about the pathological language for a number of reasons. One, because it can minimize or stigmatize people who truly do have those illnesses. Two, I think there's so much projection, assumption, and just like bullshit that goes on in like putting that label on anyone else other than ourselves, especially people online. And that is just harmful. Like, it's actively harmful. Please don't do it. And even when we're using that language for ourselves, I think we have to be very cautious when doing so. And I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, but not least of all is the fact that you do not have to have a pathological problem in order to have a problem. Like, for something to be pathological, it has to meet a very specific criteria. And I suppose I worry that when people are pathologizing like tarot collecting and consumerism, that it almost creates, similar to what's happened with alcoholism, it's this idea that, you know, you have to reach a certain limit, you have to reach a certain level of bad or unhealthy before you can stop and reflect as to whether this is something that's actually serving you. And the same goes for people who are making videos about it. I haven't seen a lot of videos that have, but I remember a long time ago, I sort of worried about the way some people were reflecting on their own experience and like justifying why they were deciding to cull their collection or change their habits. It's like, rather than just talking about the fact that this wasn't healthy, it wasn't serving them, it's almost like they felt the need to maximize their experience to pathologize it, to justify a need to change. And I think that sends a message to an extent that you don't have to reflect. You don't have to consider whether something is serving you, whether you want to be doing something truly or not, whether something is healthy for you or not, unless you reach a pathological level. Does that make sense? And I don't think that's healthy or helpful for anybody. I don't think it's a healthy contribution to the conversation. Because I know for me, and this is like tangential, I know, rather than just being able to ask myself the question, is this healthy? Is this what I want? Is this serving me? I was asking, am I an addict? Essentially, until I thought it was pathological, I didn't have to change my behaviors. And that is just like so not helpful and so counterintuitive. But I do think that sometimes this language, this pathological language, or this like leaning towards pathological language, can be really unhelpful. And personally, I think, especially when we're talking about it in community, I think it's so much more helpful to more people to discuss the impacts and the behaviors rather than the labels. I think that will be much more beneficial in terms of the conversation that we can have, how many people we can include in that conversation, if we're not just sort of relegating it to words that either are specifically pathological or are sort of like imply pathological issues. Does that make sense? I hope I've made sense. I feel like this is a topic that I could like make proper notes about and make a whole video about, but I hope I've managed to sort of express what I think. This is the first time I've expressed it, so I hope I did okay. The guidebook can be just as important as the deck. I love using guidebooks for further insight to meanings, as well as further connections to the artist's intentions of their images. Sometimes the words in a guidebook are my keys to unlocking the messages just as much, if not more, than the card itself. And I totally agree. There are some guidebooks that are just wonderful, and they provide some incredible jumping off points as well as insight into the choices that the artist made or the creator made in representing the card. I think there is a bit of like a taboo around readers using guidebooks, and like I get it. I mean, I wouldn't want to pay for a reading and then someone pull out cards and then literally just read from the guidebook my message. But I do think that if we use them in the same way we use tarot, we use them as tools to sort of like get a conversation starting or get messages flowing, like, you know, pull bits out and, you know, bring context and meaning to it in the situation of a reading. Like, I think that that can be a valuable addition. No tarot or oracle deck holds any real value or power until you declare it does. The power is in the person and the intention, and it is likely affected by numerous factors. So in my unpopular opinion, you absolutely do not have to be intuitively gifted to read cards, just mindful and intentional. I totally agree. I don't really think of myself as intuitive at all. And I definitely don't think of myself as intuitively gifted. I think my ability to read the cards comes from my knowledge of the systems and like what I've learnt and taught myself over the years, and my engagement with the cards and finding patterns and connecting messages to my own lived experience. So I absolutely agree. I know not everybody will identify with this. Some people identify as intuitive and they bring that to the table when they read tarot. But I agree that I don't think you need to be intuitively gifted in order to read, because I think that's me. I think that's me. Okay, now let's move over to the Instagram unpopular opinions. Unpopular opinion, Katey Flowers is the queen of my heart. I love you, Skylar. Actually, now I'm thinking about this, when you wrote this, I took this to be like a really sweet compliment, like hyping me up. But now I'm wondering, unpopular opinion, are you suggesting that other people don't like me? Was this actually shade? I'm so confused. Reading with reversals is actually limiting. Of course, this is only my experience. I tried to include reversals in my readings. I really did, but it makes me fall back on the book meanings of the cards instead of exploring all the possibilities that they have. I too find reversals limiting, and I just find them like unnecessary a lot of the time. Like, I guess just in terms of how I personally read, like the context reveals itself in the spread for me, and like sort of worrying about reversals and stuff, I don't know, I got in my head too much about it, and whenever I did read with it, I didn't find it helpful. And for me, in my tarot journey, I've found the simpler the better. I found, at least as someone who can be an overthinker and a perfectionist and all that, for me, just keeping my tarot practice as simple as possible has allowed me to sort of breathe and open up and just be with the cards rather than in my head. And ultimately, if you get good, meaningful messages from the cards that help you, it doesn't matter how you get there, just that you do. I don't like the art on the RWT. Are you talking about the Rider-Waite-Smith? Fair enough. I know it's a divisive deck. I actually quite like it. I find it quite charming in a lot of ways, but I know that a lot of people absolutely detest it, and that's fair enough. Someone else said, I hate the colors. The world simply does not contain that much yellow. Maybe I just like it because yellow is my favorite color. I have a really unpopular opinion, and I hope I don't offend anyone. I think that hardcore tarot and oracle card collecting takes away from the sacredness of the cards. I'm just speaking from personal experience, but I fall into consumerist spirals when I buy too many decks instead of using the ones I have a strong connection to for guidance. I'm not saying that you can't have a connection to the cards if you have a large collection, but I see a lot of unnecessary consumerism within the tarot community. I definitely agree with you in the sense that, like, if I'm thinking constantly about the next deck, I'm just not spending time with the decks that I currently own. For me, it doesn't take away from the sacredness of my cards because I don't see them as sacred, but it does take away from just the time that I'm spending with the cards. Quality time, it's my love language, and if I'm not investing it, then I'm not connecting. Pretty sure this is terrible, but as a cis het reader, I'm not helped at all by diverse decks. Some of the situations depicted are not part of my experience, so they don't tend to resonate with me. I believe the cards are universal and the messages that needs to get across will always come through regardless of the art. That said, if it is more accessible for some to read with one of the aforementioned decks, then that's 100% of what they should be using, and makes sense that there are more out there now. I think I understand what you're meaning, although it sort of sounds like you contradict yourself a little bit there with like saying that you don't resonate with diverse decks, but then the cards are universal. The vast majority of tarot decks on the market are still cis heteronormative. There are very, very few decks that are exclusively not. So I just don't really see the point in this opinion, I guess, when like as a cis het person who wants to see themselves in the cards, you have so many options. In fact, you could almost pick up any random deck and you're probably going to see yourself in that deck, as opposed to someone who's not cis het. Like they would have to actively go out of their way to find a deck that represented them. I'm sorry if I'm misunderstanding you. I just don't really understand. I think you're trying to say that that's why you don't use diverse decks. And I guess all I'm thinking is that it must be nice to have so many options. And I guess that's just what we would like for everybody to have options in seeing themselves in the cards. I'm of the unpopular opinion that twin flame narrative is overrated and actually causes more damage for some people. I think love readings are out of control, and I've recently started focusing on helping my clients reflect more on themselves emotionally, spiritually, and financially. I don't know if that is an unpopular opinion. Am I wrong? Maybe it's unpopular like historically, but I think at least in the community, like the online TarotTube community that I participate in, I've heard this, maybe not specifically about twin flames, but certainly about like love readings and people focusing on, you know, when will I find love, or will my partner come back to me? Those sort of readings being oftentimes sort of quite disempowering. And I don't know, the community that I'm a part of anyway is very much focused on empowering readings, almost like exclusively so. But on a personal note, I do sort of agree with you in the sense that I don't really like the idea of twin flames, and I think it can be quite unhelpful and toxic to people a lot of the time. I don't like the look of gilded edges, with some exceptions, and the fact that it can be scratched easily doesn't help my opinion of it. Colored edging is fine though. I think it totally depends on the deck. Like some gilding I just like wish wasn't there, like especially if it's just not good quality, because you're right, it is just going to chip off. And sometimes, like especially with some of the Hay House decks that they gild, the cards are like so stuck together that you have to peel each card apart, and then half the time I end up like ripping a piece of the card, like it gets stuck to the gilding. So in that case, I just wish they wouldn't do it. But then I do have some gilding on other cards that is beautifully done, and I've had for years and hasn't had any problems. But aside from those like quality control issues, I think gilding is very much a personal preference. My unpopular opinion is that a lot of decks have really pretty art, but are so hard to read with because the creator hasn't included any symbolism to work from. I often find decks that are like overly, like really, really densely symbolic and like heavy occult symbolism. I find them difficult to read because I just feel like it's like overcomplicates the message, at least for how I read. Like I understand that some people like absolutely love diving into that element of tarot, like the heavy symbolism. I just kind of don't care. So I think that's why I often tend to prefer more scenic decks. So I think there's just different styles and approaches out there for everybody, which is nice. Why riffle shuffle when you can corner shuffle? Still get a great mix, but don't have to bend the shit out of your decks. That's funny because I don't know, maybe it's with different card stock. I actually find corner shuffling ends up like bending the corners up more than riffle shuffling does. I don't really like hard riffle shuffle, so maybe, I don't know. I just sort of try to do whatever works best for each deck, whichever's most comfortable. But I mean, if that works for you, that's good. Thick end or cardstock is a good cardstock. What crap? People keep repeating this one in one way or another, saying that thick cardstock spracks of sturdiness and durability without even thinking about that the most durable cardstock that has been created so far is for casino playing cards. The only reason thick cardstock might last long is because it gets less used. Decks these days are made for collectors, not for users, and no matter how much these same people stress out that they are not collectors, they have most certainly the mindset of one while making preference on cardstock. Gilded edges, matte finish, gold stamping, you name it, all very fancy, but none enhancing the physical usability of a deck. On the contrary, it usually diminishes it. Okay, firstly, as someone who worked in a casino, casino cardstock tends to be plastic. And I think up until recently, making tarot decks in plastic was not something that a lot of people had access to and was often much, much, much more expensive. I do agree with you that like really thick cardstock I don't find particularly easy to use, and so I don't like it either. As for matte cardstock, I do think that that adds to the physical usability of a deck. I think they're often much easier to shuffle than some like really plasticky decks. Additionally, they tend to just like lay down on the desk or wherever you're reading much easier rather than like slipping around. So I think matte cardstock can enhance the usability depending on the quality, I suppose. And ultimately, I think you're sort of missing the point that a lot of people just like pretty things. Whether they're collectors or not, people like pretty things. So I don't know, there's elements of your opinion that I both agree and disagree with, I guess. If creators don't want to reprint their decks on their own, they should really put them on make playing cards or the like. The aftermarket for out of print decks is absolutely monstrous, and none of that money goes to the creator. I think if people want to do that, they certainly can. I don't think there's any obligation for a creator to do that if they don't want to. And I also wonder if that would actually reduce the value of decks from the outset. Like I wonder if people would spend $100, $150, which is how expensive some decks are, on fancy boxes and gilding and like the original printing, if they knew that in a couple of years' time they could get it off make playing cards, yes, with crappy cardstock, but for $15. So I wonder if that would actually reduce the value and like the monetary compensation that artists get when they initially published their decks, if that was like a thing that we knew all creators would do. And you could argue that's a good thing, but I'm just saying like I don't think that that would have necessarily only positive outcomes for the creator. I think that's especially true when people are sort of advertising decks as limited edition. Like people will pay more for something that they know they won't be able to get after a certain period of time, and to then sort of like make it actually lol, no, it's not limited edition. I think that's a bit of a dick move. For like, either don't make that promise at the beginning or stick to it. And here's my unpopular opinion. Reprinting the exact same deck is not a second edition. That's just a second printing. Those are two different things. I don't know, at least in the book world, in order for something to be a different edition, it needs to have substantial changes. So that annoys me. There's my unpopular opinion for the video. I seem to be an odd one out on this, but I really dislike borderless cards. It feels like more of a finished image to me with a border around, even just a small one. I do work with and love some borderless decks, but I'm always thinking how they'd be better with a nice, neat border. I think that definitely was an unpopular opinion, although now we're getting more borderless decks. I wonder if more people are feeling like you. I have spoken about this before as far as my opinion's concerned. I think it really depends on the deck. Some decks feel really open and like the card comes alive without borders. Other decks I sort of feel like it really suits them to have a framing for the image. It's totally a preference thing, and I think it totally depends on the deck, at least for me. Okay, I can't talk anymore. I've been filming for 2 hours. I need to stop. Thank you so much to everybody who submitted your opinions. I really enjoyed this. I hope you did too, even if I heavily disagreed with you. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you're a real trooper. Thanks so much for putting up with me. And thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all of your support. And an especially big thank you goes to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Laurie. But I'm really done talking, so that's it for the outro. Thanks so much for being here. See you next week. Much love. Bye.